Welcome to the Concast. I'm Adam Shams. I'm here with my usual co-host, Matthias Fallon. Today we have a very special guest, Grant Sanderson of 3Blue1Brown. You all know who he is, but in case not, he runs the YouTube channel 3Blue1Brown, focused on, I guess, more of like STEM topics with like visual animations and stuff. I'm sure he can explain a lot better than I can, but welcome on.
Thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to the chat.
No, we've been looking forward to this too. We're really excited to have you. I guess let's just like jump right into it. Like, what would you say inspired 3Blue1Brown, like for you to start it? And how did your passion for mathematics kind of evolve over time?
Okay, two very good questions. When I started it, it wasn't necessarily with the thought, hey, I want to have like a YouTube channel. I want to grow it out. There definitely was some background inspiration in the form of just enjoying other educational content online. So this was 2015 when I uploaded the first video. So it's late enough in YouTube's career that, like some channels had developed, and Minute Physics comes to mind as one that I really liked, or Numberphile. These things existed. But it was sort of this first wave of educational YouTubers where there's just a small handful of the OG educational YouTubers. Yeah. So that was probably there in the back of my mind as just a proof of concept that, hey, there's an appetite online for people to learn about potentially esoteric things. And then B, just, it's like of the forms of outlet that I could think of, as opposed to just giving one-on-one lessons or like doing certain talks or things, the idea of uploading a YouTube video is going to be in there in some way. So as I was finishing up college, I was kind of going back and forth between whether I wanted to do more math or more computer science. I've always had a passion for math. It was more in university that I kind of enjoyed programming as well and would do summer internships at software companies. But at the end of all of those internships, I would come back with the feeling, what I really want to do is more math in some way. But then ironically, as I started focusing more on math, I was like, I'm actually itching for a good personal programming project as well. So anytime I was on one side of the fence, I would itch for the other half. And one of the ways of scratching that itch, I just started putting together a very scrappy visualization library to explain certain math topics in ways that lent themselves to thinking of functions as transformations as opposed to graphing them. I made an initial video with this that it's a bad video. It's not a good video, but it's like something to initially use the tool in a way where I could say, okay, I know that I've in some sense completed this personal project. Whereas it's so easy for personal projects that don't have any kind of deadline to just sort of taper out and you lose interest and never quite have a clear finishing point. So the act of uploading some kind of lecture was as good a notion of that as any. I enjoyed it. I improved the tool a little bit in the process of making a second video, and then by making a second video, I don't know if it was the second or the third. So somewhere along the way, I ended up just getting in conversations with Khan Academy, and they had a program that they were doing called the talent search, where they were looking to hire more content creators, and the timing lined up well where I made some submissions to that, got into some conversations. Long story short, I ended up working for them for a bit, and so was making con style videos as my day job, and then by night would kind of continue with the 3Blue1Brown stuff centered around visualizations. And it's one of those back and forths where the more videos I made, the more I would hack on the tool, the more the tool developed, and the more fluid it would be to make a video. And then that cycle just kind of has continued since then.
How do you think the con style of, I guess, producing math videos kind of complement your own style, and did that affect the own trajectory of your own channel?
It did. I mean, the con style in some ways it's a lot more honest, right? You're just describing something at the speed of thought. You're just sitting down. It's as if you're doing a tutorial one-on-one with someone. You're not overproducing it. It's about the content of the explanation more than it is about any production quality around it.
Right.
And so that's very healthy for me, where I think I maybe would be too far on the other end of the spectrum on trying to make something look pristine and beautiful as I could. I do think with certain topics, it can be very nice to see it visualized in a way that's hard to draw by hand. And often when I'm choosing a topic, I'll consider, hey, does me putting in the extra time to do that merit, does it result in a better explanation as a result? Is it just, icing on the top, or is it something that actually changes what someone's intuition with this topic might be? So for example, early on I did this series about linear algebra, partly because a lot of people take linear algebra, but even more importantly, that's one where the difference between drawing it out by hand versus having a little bit of animation to show the idea of like inputs moving to their outputs or thinking of matrices as transformations, it allowed potentially for this qualitatively different approach that would have been harder in the con style, doable for sure. Yeah. And like Sal does this all the time, but it just makes it a little bit easier to digest, I think, for the student potentially. One of the shifts though, my original conception for the channel was very much more esoteric topics, like the kinds of math that you're not going to see in school, but that, you know, I'm very tickled by and maybe others would be as well. But time at Khan Academy maybe solidified a potentially obvious truth, which is that the most valuable math to put online is the math that people actively need help with. And there's a time and a place for the more specific niche topics that are letting a bunch of math nerds kind of share in a community of other math nerds with this. But that should always take second place to education and helping those who need help. And maybe without Khan Academy, I could have like come to this lesson, but it probably sped it up a little bit by seeing, you know, the feedback and the gratitude from students on that platform when I'd make something and it was clear that it was doing something for them in the class that they were taking, rather than just fanning the flames for math enthusiasm from someone who was already kind of into it in the first place. Yeah.
When it comes to, I guess, educating, what makes like a good visualization, and what is something that's just like unhelpful? Like,
well, every motion should have a reason for it. I think that's one thing where I'm almost certainly guilty of overdoing this, and I'm not going to pretend that I show the restraint that like should be shown. But I will see a lot of channels have some kind of motion in what's going on that's simply for the sake of having some kind of visual intrigue. Like there's a character on the screen and it's like bobbling around, or, you know, an equation is like wiggling in some way, or just like transitions between them. Where on the one hand, I get, okay, it sometimes feels a little bit flat or static if everything is just like you're going through a slideshow. But I really try to think about, okay, if motion is being used, it's because there's a fact that's relevant to the lesson that's being communicated. So,
sure, I
don't know, a thing I'll commonly do, there might be part of an equation that like transforms into a geometric representation. You know, you've got like the symbol x squared or something, and like that symbol turns into a square somewhere. Now, on the one hand, that's just me having fun with the fact that like there's a very easy way to have anything turn into anything using the tool, and like it just looks like a fun morphing transition. Yeah. But there's there's an ability to basically conceptually tie, hey, this symbol here corresponds with that part of the diagram in a way that you don't have to say in words, and you don't have to like add new content to the screen by like drawing an arrow between it, but you can much more subtly just say like, this part corresponds to that. And like when you see this part, you should let it expand in your mind, where you're not just thinking of the symbols x squared, but you're thinking of, okay, what is the area of the square? What does that actually mean? And when that's the principle, that, you know, every line that's drawn, every thing on the screen has a reason for being there. Every motion has a reason that's in the service of whatever intuition you're trying to convey. I think that can keep things cleaner and a little bit more consistent. Because the other thing is, it's so easy to like overload the cognitive processing of whatever student is watching something, where you don't want it to be the case that the things they have to process are like the words being spoken, and also the things that's being shown on screen, and also like how those things are moving around. What's better is if there's just a single idea you're trying to convey, and like all of the different inputs into their brain are working in concert for conveying whatever that idea is, such that it feels like a single thing being said, rather than feeling like, oh, there's three things simultaneously. Yeah. Simple example would be, if there's a word on the screen, you should be saying that word. Like, you shouldn't say a different word. This extends beyond videos, but a common criticism for most academic talks given is that slides have way too much text. And aside from it being the case that they have too much text, it's just that the text is different from what the person is saying. So your verbal processing would have to be doing two things at once. And in reality, the audience is going to just make a choice to either read or listen, but they can't do both. And beyond just text and verbal processing, I think that same idea translates to a lot of other kinds of processing.
I guess another thing that you brought up was you kind of moved on from like esoteric videos to more, I guess, a theme of videos that people kind of need to like learn and is more impactful for people. Do you think we should, I guess, consider, I guess, YouTube as a possible substitute for STEM subjects when applicable?
What do you mean by substitute in that sentence?
I mean, as like, I guess it's like, is it viable to kind of utilize YouTube as the primary source of learning?
Well, okay, so yes and no.
Yeah.
Emphasis on the no. I think when we're thinking of learning, it's very easy to focus on the explanation half of it. You know, person who knows the thing articulates some knowledge. That knowledge like flies through the air and then like somehow embeds itself into the mind of the student. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Yeah. You instead want to think about what are you bringing out from within the student? Where, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's so easy to learn things in the moment, maybe even learn it long enough to do well on the test. And then a year later, you look back at some class you took and you're like, oh, wait, no, what? I can't remember anything from that.
Yeah.
Like, or there's specific facts that aren't there. And that's so common. And this is not just for schoolwork, but also when people read books. You know, if you ask any adult about a nonfiction book they read more than a year ago, it's very hard to get out any like facts that really stuck. I think the facts that stick are the ones that you feel like you kind of came up with yourself, or that you played a role with yourself. And maybe that takes the form of solving a problem. Maybe that takes the form of you created a thing and you needed to come up with a little subcomponent in order to write your program or build, you know, an object in your garage or whatever it might be. And so in that sense, the role of an explainer is not so much taking information that they're jabbering off and like shoving it into the head of someone, but setting the context that really brings out from the student. And I think, you know, my favorite fact along these lines is that the etymology for the word education shares a root with the word educe. So they both kind of come from the idea of bringing out. So in the word itself, it's already implying that it's not about the explanation. So what that would mean is that you're never going to have a form of learning calculus that simply takes the form of like a student sitting and receiving things from a YouTube video. Right. YouTube videos in general it's very, very hard to use that medium to genuinely bring things out from students. What I think they can do is provide some of the fertile territory such that there's ambient intuitions that the student can leverage to then solve problems or doing whatever they're doing in class with a little bit less friction. You have multiple different concepts for how to think about a derivative. Then when you're doing your exercises, rather than it seeming intractable, it's something where you can pull from these different potential conceptions. Or you've had the experience of watching someone solve a problem and vicariously feel like, oh, I could do that. It gives you a sense of confidence in knowing, hey, when you're faced with some problem elsewhere, you're not just completely at a wall. You've kind of gone through the motions vicariously with whatever YouTube educator you're watching, like Sal going through a worked problem. Which sort of necessarily means insofar as YouTube content gets more and more coverage for all of the topics, and that's very helpful for education, it's only insofar as it's laying that groundwork that still needs a different environment when the actual learning happens. Some students are very self-motivated, and some students simply from watching the video can go off to their own piece of paper and take some ownership over it. Or if I say like, pause and ponder and think about this, they actually do. They pause and they think about it and they pull out some paper. Great. When that happens, that's great. And you can maybe have a YouTube-centric learning experience. Yeah. The vast majority of cases, though, are ones where it should be thought of as this supplement. And in the best world, it's all the things that Sal will talk about in terms of, you know, reversing the classroom such that you spend more of the time with your teacher, letting that teacher serve as a coach in your problem solving rather than as the explainer kind of spewing out facts from the front of the classroom. So yes, it stands to have a strong role, but like not in a full replacing one. Yeah. Like maybe it replaces lectures entirely. There's just not even a notion of the teacher standing up front and lecturing on a particular topic. But even then, realistically, whatever problem solving session you have with your class time, there's going to be times when you want to like step back, take 5 minutes to answer a common question to all the students before you go back and let them go kind of on their own again.
I guess for you, what makes a math concept interesting? And with that, how do you narrow down what topics are worth making a video on and what might be like too niche or like too broad?
Well, you asked earlier how my relationship with math changed. I'm not sure if I actually answered it, but one of the changes would be that my younger self found things interesting for much more pure reasons in that I didn't care about the math touching other topics. If there was something that simply seemed challenging, but then a shift in how you viewed it could make it seem easier, that was just such a beautiful kind of idea. And there's enough problems in math that come up like this, where someone comes up with the right way of viewing it that turns something that seemed impossible to instead seeming tractable. Like, that's what would really get me going. And it still does to some extent. But as the years have gone on, and especially it probably is a function of being more distant from like academic settings, I am more motivated by things that just help you build things, that you can imagine how it solves some problem that's outside of math, or maybe another problem within math, but that's outside of that particular field. And in some sense, you could compress this all as saying like a shift from liking pure math to wanting it to be applied. But it's not like applied math in the sense of what sorts of topics fall under courses with the name applied math. It's more that before I'm really sold on a subject, I can't just see that a hard problem was solvable. I also have to have some sense that the patterns associated with that problem have any chance of being relevant to things outside of it. And I don't know if this bleeds into the content as much as maybe it should, but I think as time goes on, I'll try to do a lot more to motivate a given topic with respect to things outside of the topic, rather than just saying like, here's this problem, let's begin.
I'm also kind of curious, what do you think drives innovation in math in today's world?
You mean in like research math?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. It's very cultural, I would say, right? It's because it's not the case that you have an ultimate goal, like let's get to the moon, and then everything is served in the function of that ultimate goal. But instead, you do have things kind of like that in the form of certain problems or certain categories of math that the broader community recognizes as important. So, classic examples people might have come across are like the unsolved problems, like the Riemann hypothesis and things. Yeah. But the truth is that that's probably not the majority of the types of motivating structures that will dictate the course of research math. Instead, there's sometimes, like the Langlands program is maybe an example here, where it's not a particular problem, but there's this broad category of connections and relationships between seemingly disparate fields where people have this suspicion that there's a lot more connections there. And so as kind of this very large research project, you have different people trying to piece together different parts of that connection. And if you were to say what drives that, some of it is just that sufficiently important people have declared that it's important, right? You have a Fields medalist who says, wow, this seems like an important problem. And that stirs part of the community in its direction. Some of it is a shared instinct for what, some of these connections in the Langlands program like have helped to solve previously very difficult to solve problems. Like Fermat's last theorem would be maybe the most famous example there. Maybe by furthering the spirit of what was done there, it helps to unlock other problems. I would say most of the pure math community, they're not thinking of solving other problems in an applied sense, like, wow, this is going to unlock the ability to get to Mars more economically or anything like that. But instead, it's just the idea that maybe for a random puzzle that comes their way, like the probability that they could solve it goes up by a little bit, whether that puzzle was motivated from like the physics department or whether it was coming from like a colleague in the math department. It's more just a desire to be able to solve more things. This
is a little off topic, but how do you see, I guess, AI and machine learning tools kind of transforming the way that we try and learn and also teach math?
There was one of the math teachers who's sort of a little more in the public sphere, who I like quite a bit, Dan Meyer. I saw on Twitter the other day he was like sharing pictures from some slides in a talk that he was giving. And while I didn't see the talk, there was one slide that gave me some sense of what he might be getting at. It's a thing I've thought about a lot before, where this is terrible to describe in a podcast. You know the meme where there's an anime character looking at a butterfly and he's like, is it a blank?
Yeah.
So it shows many different technologies where it's like from radio to TV to the early internet to like Web 2.0. This character being like, is this like a replacement for universities?
Yeah.
And that AI is just the last in a sequence there. And the reason that there's a lot of like truth to the joke there is that like when radio came out, there were these radio universities and there was public intellectuals speaking to how radio will replace the university because you can have the voice of the best lecturer suddenly reach millions of people in a way that never happened before. Same thing happened with TV. Same thing happened with the early internet where there's a lot of .com kind of bubble companies that sold themselves as like replacements for universities and then didn't pan out. You have the 2010s like MOOCs sort of doing that where there's value from the MOOCs for sure, but I think everyone would agree that it's not something that ended up replacing college in the way that some of the early rhetoric suggested that it might. And so the question is, are large language models just the latest in an iteration where better communication technology looks like it's going to replace universities and all of that, but actually does something else? Now, the case for that would be, history repeating itself and the idea that education is not about better communication. It's just the whole idea that you want to like bring it out from the student. But the case against would be like, maybe this one's something fundamentally new because by its very nature, it's not necessarily something that's purely propagating existing information, but creates a genuinely more interactive environment for the student. Right. Now, as it stands right now, what it looks like to me, and to all the people who I know who like work a little bit more closely with this and how it intersects with students, is like for the students who are already doing pretty well and they have enough intellectual self-awareness to even know what kind of questions to ask and to be skeptical about the answers when they need to be skeptical and essentially would otherwise be self-directed. These are amazing tools. They just completely unlock like a fluidity to learning new things that was possible before, but just had a little bit more friction. But for the students who are a little bit more typical, that don't necessarily have that same internal drive mixed with a self-awareness for what is necessary for learning new things. Like it's actually just kind of hard to learn new things. And even when you're motivated, it's maybe a little bit hard to identify what questions you should be asking. In that stage, it doesn't seem like LLMs are a be all and end all, and if anything, they can sort of perpetuate misconceptions. And one friend of mine who works in this used the phrase "garbage in, garbage out," which maybe is a little bit harsh, both to the student and to the LLM. But there's something to that, where if you're not really asking the right question, you're also not going to be getting the right answer. And then underlying all of this is also the main issues with education and limiting factors for new students learning new things are problems of motivation, not of explanation quality. So if you haven't done anything to solve like what motivates the student to learn this topic, it doesn't matter what you're putting in front of them, like what the teacher is, what the model is, anything like that. Like until you solve the motivation problem, you haven't hit the thing that matters the most. I'm not sold that LLMs can serve for that motivation. I really do think you need, like, the things that motivate us are probably first and foremost our peers, right? And then second from that, it's going to be the people who are, there's some... Speaking of AI, that's not great. Like, whatever, I don't know what
I give you like your thumbs, you just get like
I noticed that earlier. I was like on a call and I did that and it was like putting up like emoji. Yeah, how does...
Do you got balloons now?
Why is this a feature?
So, great.
Oh.
This is illustrating better than I ever could. Like, people trying to get AI to do things that don't make sense in the moment.
Yeah.
I do not need a thought bubble for a thumbs up when my thumbs up is visible on the screen already. And so in the same way, like with certain educational things, how often is it the case that someone's throwing an LLM at it simply because they want to seem current and relevant, not because there was a previously intractable problem that the LLM unlocked?
Grant, it feels like the visual examples follow you everywhere.
Great. There I blathered on for like 4 minutes in a way that like one single image conveys so much more effectively.
Just a thumbs up, thumbs down. So I guess with that, kind of continuing on this like whole AI thing, your work does kind of explore complex systems and mathematical concepts. I guess you see any parallels between these topics and challenges today in developing like artificial general intelligence?
Between dynamic systems and the kinds
Yeah.
of puzzles that I'll talk about and AGI. Well, first of all, I don't know what people mean by AGI, so I can't.
I think they just mean like any sort of general intelligence based off of machine learning. That's what I got out of it. But
Okay, is GPT-4 AGI? Because it's general in the sense that it wasn't trained for specific particular tasks, but the same structure and algorithm does it. So like, okay, general, like intelligent.
But I'd also group that more as generative.
But I don't even mean
thing.
generative. Like, even if you were giving it classification problems, there's a generality in that there's a wide body of different kinds of problems that the same training procedure like allowed it to solve. And so it's general in that sense, independent of whether it's generative. And then intelligent, I mean, that's a sticky enough term, but like, you know, for most academic tests, if you pit it against like most people, like it's, okay, it doesn't do better than all of them, but like it does better than most of them.
Yeah.
And I think everyone, like, you know, myself included, would say like whatever we want to mean by AGI, like it doesn't hit it. But in a very literal term, like it's artificial, it's general, and it has something that deserves to be called intelligence. So I literally don't know what people mean. And I think you talk to 10 different people and they give you 10 distinct answers on what the threshold is for what they think like will be AGI. And therefore,
if
like,
you had to describe it, what would you put it as? Or just more
I don't
like,
know.
kind of like,
well, I don't believe that everyone talks about it as if there's this discrete point, like there's a pre-AGI and there's a post-AGI. I just don't think that exists. Like, I think you just get things that are slowly better. Like sometimes you get these sharper upticks on the graph of abilities in certain specific domains, and then other specific domains follow. Like, people talk about it like there's one day you wake up and like all of the jobs are suddenly replaceable.
Yeah.
And I don't, that doesn't fit with my model for how things would be likely to play out. Anyway, the spirit of your question was more about whether the kinds of mathematical problems that I enjoy discussing on the channel have a relevance to unlocking some of the challenges sitting between whatever the limitations of capabilities are now versus later. In some way, like a lot of the challenges, a lot of the improvements that people have found in recent years were not a function of new insights about like the algorithms, but it was simply scale. And there's a lot of technical challenges that go with that. Like, how do you scale something up a lot? I think the architecture underlying a lot of the modern networks, this thing called a transformer, it was born in a paper called Attention is All You Need. Yeah. And you could argue one of the reasons that it works better is not anything about like this attention mechanism per se, or about like the specific way that modules were hooked together per se, but that the architecture stripped out all of the things that aren't parallelizable, such that what you can run can be parallelized across, you know, multiple cores on a GPU, and essentially unlocked an ability to do things at larger scales than you could before, at least with natural language processing, but then after a lot of other things as well, which would, you know, there's people who will argue that just the main factor determining that these things did better was the fact that you could scale them, which feels more like an engineering question than a pure math puzzle, you know, really understanding this dynamic system. And if anything, a lot of the like mathematical understanding comes following the innovations. You have a new model that does a new thing, and then all of the people who want a mathematical model of it go and try to do the modeling to unpack, wait, how does it do the thing that it could do? It didn't go the other way around, where they anticipated a certain, you know, sequence of operations that could correspond to storing factual knowledge along with like grammar and syntax, and then let that dictate what the model was. It's like, no, the thing dictating the model structure was engineering concerns, like make sure it's parallelizable. So in that way, no. But, you know, to get from whatever this chapter is to the next one, you're probably going to have some change in what the architecture is. Maybe that is motivated by a better understanding that comes from like very mathematical probings at like the current models. Like there's an interesting body of research around mechanistic interpretability that sometimes just looks like applied linear algebra to parse these things. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just like, it's awesome as an application of like linear algebra. And maybe enough of that helps understand what's going on now such that you can tweak and tune it to be better later. And that would be a wonderful shining example of where like deeper knowledge and deeper intuition about linear algebra helped unlock something new. But that's also like, it has a very different flavor from modern pure math research. But the truth is, I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea what types of problem solving will unlock the next chapter, and whether it has more the flavor of engineering to scale things up, or more the flavor of like deep mathematical intuition that unlocks some understanding of what's really going on.
No, that's great. I guess moving back to Manum, when you were creating it, I understand that it was more of like a passion project. Did you look at, I guess, existing tools, and was there a certain gap you're trying to fill, or it was more that like you just wanted to make this thing from scratch as like a hobby?
Definitely the latter. Yeah, if it was the case that I wanted to like start a YouTube channel around visualizing math, I would have done much more of a survey of existing tools and probably built on top of them. Like, very good chance I would have just built something on top of Mathematica, because it had such a broad base of not just mathematical tools, but like visualization ones. I had an itch to do something that was from scratch as a personal programming project. Yeah.
Could you, I guess, share some of the challenges that you encountered while developing Manum and how you addressed them?
I mean, there's so many. I guess early on, well, okay, these might be more boring answers than they should be. In the earliest version of it, I think because I was a math student where a lot of the pure math is taught, this isn't always the case, but it's often taught in set theoretic terms, where everything that you define is like a set, of points that have like certain properties.
Sure.
The model, like the data model for how anything was represented, was as a point cloud, in a way that was like extreme and silly and didn't make sense. Like, even text on screen would be stored as like a cloud of points, and that cloud of points could like change and move to something else. So horribly inefficient in certain ways.
Sure.
And there also like wasn't good anti-aliasing in accommodating that. And you can like see this in an ugliness of the edges of anything early on. But it satisfied this nice itch to make it very easy to implement the idea of anything transforming into anything. In particular, I was thinking of whatever function I'm representing in some multivariable context or complex number context. You just draw the inputs, and then you like literally have them move over to the output points. And on the implementation side, you kind of don't have to think anymore about that, because everything is just points. Now, that has lots of problems. And so I guess like V2, you could say, is at some point I'm like, okay, well, this is horribly inefficient and looks bad. So I changed it such that everything was based on vector graphics, where essentially you have paths often defined with Bezier curves and splines and such, and then you've got like stroke and fill. And so it was built on top of some vector graphics rendering library that Python had, which was like better. It takes a little bit more thought than to have your like anything can transform into anything modality. But that was all well and good. But it was also kind of slower than it needed to be. Awkward because there were limitations in that underlying library. And then especially anything that was three-dimensional, it would just... I would have this very awkward way of displaying things in 3 dimensions that was kind of twisting vector graphics' arm behind its back to try to make it do things it didn't want to do. Like, there's no, depth testing or good shading, and instead there was like very hacky depth testing and hacky shading. So like the next iteration of saying, okay, maybe I should go back and do this better, was to basically implement things with OpenGL and just do things a little bit more like in the standards of what like all graphics programming ought to do from the beginning. And so there would be, vector graphics could be one part of that, but there were then alternate types that lend themselves much more naturally to 3 dimensions. Or if there was something that makes sense to display as a point cloud, doing it on a shader is just like a way more efficient way of doing it, and you could handle your anti-aliasing such that it doesn't look terrible and all of that. So there are these certain very specific things on the side of what's the underlying data model and what's literally being represented that changed over time, such that if I could go back, I'd be like, hey, while you're starting this, just learn OpenGL and like do it that way from the start. For many reasons. It's like performance, and it'll also then like I have it in a mode where you can interact with it as opposed to it just being like a static output, which is kind of nice during the development process. And the other awkward thing is, insofar as other people use the tool, I think a lot of my past mistakes just have this like legacy into the way that people use it, or the nature of the tool as it was before there was kind of this split where a community created a community version that was meant to be more stable, better documented and such. Like that split happened like before I had re-implemented things into OpenGL. So there might be a lot of legacy things there that like I feel bad that people have to deal with that they wouldn't have had to deal with if I had just done it better the first time around.
So you have your own special version for yourself, essentially.
Yeah. There's my version, and it's also open source. Anyone's welcome to use it. But the community, loosely speaking, it's like the community version is by the community for the community. So it's better tested, better documented. There's a Discord around it. Loosely speaking, mine is like by me for me, where if I'm making new things for video, it's just very freeing to kind of know that I can change the core parts of the tool as I want, or like quickly whip up something new and not, I would be a better person if everything that I wrote was also like well tested and well documented. But realistically, just new videos would take longer to make because I wouldn't have that freedom to just like try something out really quickly. And then once I tried it out, I'm like, oh, let me just make the animation I need. And like, I don't have to go back to it. Maybe I should, but I just end up not going back to it to like formalize the stuff in a way that's more stable for others if they wanted to do the same. Yeah. But part of what gives comfort doing that is knowing that the community version exists. And so if people find value in that, like, hey, they can port it over into that. And, it's not perfect, but given there's only so many hours in the day and I'm always behind on the video projects I want to do anyway, it's like a somewhat stable equilibrium.
So it kind of allows you to mess with the tool yourself and not worry about like other people needing to use the
Exactly.
tool. Okay,
exactly.
That's fair. Yeah. So I guess this is a little bit more personal, but can you recall a specific moment or experience from your own youth and childhood that really sparked your interest in like math?
One story I think I've told before on like podcast type things is when I was very little, my dad would play all sorts of games. And so there wasn't any one in particular that's like the gold answer to your question. But one that sticks in my memory just because it has carbohydrates associated with it is that he would make these interesting patterns with sugar cubes. And then, we'd play games on trying to count how many sugar cubes there were, or like think of what's the systematic way that you would count how many they were. And I don't know if this is actually the case, but in my memory, a reward for getting the correct answer was to like eat one of the sugar cubes. So I'm like Pavlov's dog, just like happily getting these positive associations with problem solving. And then these other, like I remember he built this thing that made it such that you could like create pyramids of marbles in these interesting ways that might have a hexagonal lattice base versus a square lattice base, and this like involved this custom thing to drill holes where you could like rest those marbles. And I think
that's cool.
There's not going to be any one particular lesson in those. Or like we built a hovercraft at some point where it's like you take this, we saw this in a science museum, and he was like, oh, we could do that at home. And you basically take a large disc of plywood, and then you put some plastic under it that has kind of an airtight seal, but then you poke some holes in it such that if you were to blow air into that plastic basin beneath the plywood disc, it'll fill with air, and then air will escape through the holes in like strategically located spots. And then you convert a couple leaf blowers to like blow air at a high pressure into that blank spot. And so there was like 2 leaf blowers on either side with some like custom tubing to put it in. And you basically would just be on top of a human-sized air hockey puck. And it was a blast. Yeah. So my brother and I'm sure we weren't very helpful in the construction process. I think I was like 8 years old at the time, but obviously we loved that. And then we brought it to the city's local 4th of July parade, and like painted it in patriotic colors and had some sort of punny sign holding up like a float that floats. And so I think a lot of little things like that, certainly they're going to spur an interest in math and science. Not just because the thing in and of itself is cool, like counting sugar cubes or building a hovercraft, but I think if you see a figure that you are close with, like a parent or a teacher, really deeply engaged with something, you sort of pattern match off of that engagement. So
Mm-hmm.
if it was if it was like a robot being guided by like GPT-8, like doing all of those things, it like wouldn't resonate in the same way, because it's not about the specific content. It's about like a human relationship and what you as a young person are like pattern matched into. So those are some of the early ones that stand out.
What are some goals or dreams that you have for the future, either personally or professionally? And are they like within the realm of math education, or are they like in different fields, I guess?
I'm pretty set on like trying to, in the short term future at least, like run with the current momentum on math exposition online in some form or another. I'm not one of those people who will have like some very specific goal where I say, this is the post and like I'm definitely aiming for that. But there will be principles. Like from the past, I've noticed that the material which is better course supplements, like I was referencing the series about linear algebra, or there's other series like that. One of my goals is to focus more on things like that than the ones that are maybe more specific niche topics. There will be lots of those because I can't help myself. But I think just being conscious about trying to prioritize things that I know stand to actually help people in a course type setting, that would be one goal. I think doing more to just collaborate and work with others is something where it's a thing that's come up a bit on the channel, but I think I've noticed it's something that requires being a little bit deliberate to make it happen. And I always learn more when there is something that causes me to stretch and do something kind of different than I otherwise would have. So like during the pandemic, I helped out with an MIT course about computational thinking, which was kind of using the language Julia to teach certain applied math topics. It's not something I would have done like on my own, and it was great, and I'm glad I did that. And so maybe making sure that I remain open to doing more things like that, where it's like working with someone else or a group of other people in the same spirit of math exposition stuff, but just making sure that I don't stay inside any particular rut too long or too comfortably.
What advice would you give to more like high school students who are like passionate about math, but they are kind of unsure about pursuing it like as a career? And with that, what does a career in math even mean in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice would be like, you shouldn't feel any pressure to pursue it as a career. And like, if anything, what we probably want in the world is for all the people who are really good and passionate about math, that they don't all end up filtered into the very like pure math things. And there's a couple areas where it's a common default for, math majors, for example, to go. More on like the East Coast and in the UK, I think going into finance is like a very common route there. More on like the West Coast, going into data science is a very common thing there. Universally, going into math academia, is of course a very common thing that might be on the mind of someone who's doing really, really well with the topic. Those are all great. But I think it would be amazing to have more and more math talent and problem-solving talent distributed out into other fields, whether that was other academic fields, whether that was other parts of just industry out there that otherwise doesn't as easily like recruit from those lines. And partly I think it's also that in a school type setting, so before you leave school, so let's say up until the point when you like graduate and you're doing something else, in some sense, the primary job, like your job and the goal of everything around you, is for you to grow. Like it's around you learning, it's around you becoming a better person, broadening your horizons, gaining skills, and all of that. Afterwards, the fundamental goal is about adding value to other people. And like personal growth plays into that, because sometimes in order to put yourself in a position where you can add value to other people, you need to learn something new to do that, or you need to gain a skill that you didn't have. But the difference is that it's a means to an end after school, in a way when it was kind of an end in itself in school. Mm-hmm. And so one bit of advice I would give is to basically be aware of that change, right? That's a shift in what the ultimate goal is that will happen. And also note that sometimes the interests and passions that you develop in this first phase might be particular to the fact that the end goal is personal growth. So in the case of math, it has this really central place in the education system. And I think it's because it is this necessary tool in a lot of other adjacent disciplines. Those who know their math well tend to do better in computer science and physics and like adjacent sciences in a way that it can sometimes be this rate limiter. And so as a result, we really emphasize it. We really want to make sure our elementary schoolers are like getting good math performance, and we compare how we're doing to other countries and things like that. And then that translates into praising our students, like, hey, whoa, you did well on your math test. Like, good job. Like, really proud of you for that A+. In a way that we do give praise for like other things that are maybe centered around like, did you build something that helped someone else? But somehow it's because that's not part of the like fundamental job of the student, it doesn't get quite the same spot. And so I think one thing that might accidentally happen is that those who are really passionate about math, it's out of this inertia from the importance that it had in the schooling system and how good it feels to be good at it when you're in a setting where it's so prioritized. And that might leave you with a feeling like, wow, what I really want to do is like more math in some way. Like, great, that's good. But the question you should ask is not, what's the career path such that you're doing more math? It's more like, what are the ways that the problems that can be solved in the world, the places that you can add values to others, intersect with the skill sets that you have? And the difference there is that it might open up the mind a little bit to saying like, I might be doing something that doesn't feel quite the same as what school math did, but still brings in a lot of the same skills that I now have that like puts me in a position to solve these better than others. I'm not giving very specific examples, partly because it's so hard to predict what the future will look like. You know, what are the, but there's going to be some, you know, some jobs in industry, some research pursuits in academia, you know, things like that, where the skills that you've developed now are going to be very relevant, but it requires that you kind of stretch out a little bit beyond just thinking of very pure problems and beyond thinking about what academic success in math looks like, and instead thinking of how does systematic quantitative problem solving help unlock these things. And it's just a risk that the people who are the best at it end up instead doing the, you know, the pure math academic route, or going along the, you know, a path into finance or things like that, which is fine. And there is tons of value in those, but you want to make sure that it's done with a little bit of reflection on making sure that that's really what you're going to feel most proud of, you know, 50 years from now when you're looking back.
All right. So for our last segment, we asked, we put out a forum for any Con Lab school student to submit questions. So yeah, we're just going to jump into that. Our first question, these are all anonymous. It's from a senior. What are the names of the pies in your videos?
When I originally made them, I think I had recently watched the movie Trading Places, and so I named them Randolph and Mortimer, just for the blue one and the brown one. And then in the code, we'll often abbreviate it to Randy and Morty. These were like...
So wait, are all the blue ones named Randy?
Well, see, there's not a good answer to this, because I think at some point I was like, oh, I should have like different character notions, and like thought, oh, like I've like named them different things. But then in reality, just all the blue ones in my code, I just think of it as like Randy means blue, Morty means brown, and so it's like there's 3 Randys and 1 Morty when there's the teacher-student scene, and that doesn't make any sense, especially because I don't really want them to be gendered. Like, sort of in my mind, they're like, the student body is it's not like all males, but in my mind, I don't know,
because there are distinct colors of blue, if I'm not mistaken.
From
what it looks like.
There's like 3 shades of blue in there, and so. Would you like to come up with some right now? Should we make it official in this moment?
Well, we can make it official. Okay, so we'll make the original shades. We can keep Randy. I'm not gonna.
One of the blue ones should be Randy, because otherwise I'll be very confused. But if you want to name the other two,
the other two, okay. Do you want to name one, Cerno?
No.
Because this character's name is Cerno.
Wait, say it again.
It's
Cerno?
blue. Yeah, so Cirno.
Okay, Cerno is good. I like that.
That's one. That's one. It's blue. What's another one we can do?
Great. Okay, let's say that the middle one is named Cerno.
Middle one's named Cerno. What's another like what fits well with Randy?
Well, like, I think we could. I mean, it's very weird to index off of this movie Trading Places. But we could still pull from those characters if we wanted to.
What are the characters' names? What's it called again?
IMBD. So Trading Places, it's I mean, it's such an irrelevant. It doesn't have anything to do with like. It's just like this aristocratic old set of brothers who like one.
Billy Ray Valentine, played by Eddie Murphy.
I mean, yeah, the Eddie Murphy
that's a long name.
Billy Ray Valentine.
Clarence
would be
Beeks.
Awkward to type into code.
We can do. Is it Muffy or is it Moofy? It's you, so I think that's Muffy.
Oh, Billy would work, right? It's Randy and Billy. It's like a duo.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Ezra as well.
I think that's just.
Yeah.
That's just a character. All right, we'll go with Ezra.
What about cellmate number 3?
Are you actually? There's cellmate number 3.
Yeah.
How?
Cellmate number 3.
All right, we'll do cellmate number 3. It's official. You heard it here first.
Yeah,
These are the
true.
names, I guess.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Moving on to yeah, of course. Moving on to probably a more productive question. It's from a middle schooler who says, I'm often intimidated by other people who are better at quote-unquote real math, like counting, probability, number theory, etc. Do you have any tips on learning those topics or mindset changes that can help me learn?
Well, okay, so the intimidation factor is one where you got to realize two things. One of them is that skill always comes from experience. Certainly it always benefits from experience, but sometimes in very subtle ways, such that you could have two students in a class. They both listen to the same lecture, and then one of them seems to be way better at the homework. But what's actually happening is that student 5 years ago, like, did a bunch of similar problems that, like, had similar strategies involved, and they can draw on that. So in the moment, it doesn't necessarily, it looks like you both went through the same experience, and then one of them is doing better, but recognize that sometimes it's actually because of deeper seated experience. I think this especially happens with math because of how interconnected it is. This dovetails into the second part of the question for how to get better. It always comes from problem solving. So I think,
you're right.
Like, rather than thinking about, listening to lecturers or YouTube videos or reading books, like those can be, obviously I make YouTube videos, like I think there's help there, but the way that it happens is by maybe unlocking certain ideas or planting seeds. But where you'll actually learn, the things that will actually be the experience that you then can draw on 5 years from now to, seem faster and all that, is from just solving some problems yourself. And so just taking out the time to do that, having some little time in the day when you carve out and you say, hey, I'm going to try some of the problems from the back of this, whether it's a combinatorics book or number theory or whatever the homework is. And like, don't feel the pressure to do it quickly. I think do problems slowly to learn from them, and then don't over-index on the fact that if your peers are doing them quickly, that makes them seem smarter. Because when you're doing it fast, it's because there's some time in the past when you did it, slowly to solidify the intuition. And so to the last part, the mindset shift, realizing that like what looks like genius is this residue of experience. I think that should hopefully give a lot of the mindset shift that will benefit anyone.
That's great advice, honestly. Our next question is from a sophomore, which is, how much sleep did you get in high school, and how about now?
I think I got a fair bit. I don't know, like I definitely wasn't staying up. Keep in mind, I was from a generation that was before smartphones were as omnipresent, and therefore there just wasn't like a notion of like lying in bed. I don't know. I assume kids do this because everyone does this. They like lie in bed and like scroll through things, which seems terrible and just like horribly unhealthy as the way to end your day.
Yeah.
And so
you've expressed your like, I guess, I don't know if disdain is a proper word for like YouTube shorts, but
yeah, disdain might be a little. I don't like it.
Harsh,
I don't like what it does to society. I do think that there's really good content there. Like it's great, and like actually I think it's quite healthy for creators to have a forcing function to be succinct. I think that's great. But the act of doom scrolling, like it's clearly just we should view that the same way we view drugs. Like it's clearly addictive. Sure. It's clearly not good. And so I'm going to guess that maybe simply for that reason, I probably got better sleep than like the average student does these days. I mean, I remember being very frustrated about like really early morning classes where in high school I would have to like drive in for a 0th hour physics lab. And like I would have to get up I lived in a snowy town, so I'd have to like scrape off the car in the driveway from all the ice. But I think that I don't ever remember feeling like, man, I'm so sleep deprived. Like I also didn't, I didn't drink coffee or anything. The other day I was like engaging with this high school student who was like 9 p.m. and they were like, oh, I got to get a cup of coffee because I've got this test tomorrow. Like, who are you? Talking like a 25-year-old who's got like a report due for their boss. Like, just go to sleep. It's fine. Yeah.
So now, even now, I guess, with the ability to doom scroll, do you still feel like you get a lot of sleep, or does that affect you as well?
I mean, I'm to a fault have like just tried not to engage with the short form videos as a consumer. Like, I just don't. In the same way that like I know I would love cocaine, but I just don't do it. Like, I just don't open those apps, and I'm missing.
Yeah.
It's bad in some ways because I'm missing out on like some good content, and like as a content creator, I probably don't have a good empathy for what like constitutes a really good piece in that. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I'll binge watch some things with my wife or whatnot, like in a way that maybe like would go to sleep a little bit earlier. But I feel like I get good sleep, and that's a thing I generally prioritize. Like, it really does come kind of before everything else. Like, if you get sleep and you get exercise down, like so many other things follow well.
These are two different questions I'm combining because they're pretty similar. The first one was, what music do you like and why? And the next one was, how is math and music connected? Also, how good are you at the guitar?
I don't have a great answer to the music that I like. If you look at what I actually listen to, like my Spotify Wrapped and such, like, I don't know if I feel proud of this because most of my listening, I have like playlists while I'm coding that's just it's like EDM and things like that. That's like non-lyrical and has a beat. It's like, I wouldn't recommend it, but boy, do I love it while coding. I have like a playlist while I'm running that's meant to be set at a certain, like, just songs of certain beats per minute that like keep a pace that I want to keep, and largely just like pop songs. It's not ones where I feel like, ooh, there's this niche artist that I can like brag to people about. The more tangential ones, like, I don't know, one of my favorite bands is Mumford & Sons. I just, that's one where I think very often if there's a song that I hadn't heard before, I would feel confident that I would like it, whereas sometimes with bands it can be very hit or miss. I had a penchant for bluegrass just because when I was younger I'd play a lot of music in that genre. Math and music, there's clearly some connection going on there that I suspect has to do with the notion of like patterns and abstractions. Do you two play music?
I mean, I do.
What do you play?
I play a lot of brass instruments, but mainly the euphonium.
Okay, awesome. And do you notice this thing that'll sometimes happen where if you're learning some piece, what seems like a really complicated sequence, like once you practice it a little bit, you stop thinking about it at the level of individual notes, but like the modular thing that you're thinking about is like these collections of notes that like you've sort of programmed in your brain to play that collection as if it was just one thing. And then that can make it such that you can build up more and more complicated things, and you can improvise more easily because you're not thinking note by note. You're thinking in terms of like chord progressions and this. Groupings. That feels to me very similar to what it feels like to get better at math, where things which involve a lot of moving parts and a lot of connections, like once you take these collections of patterns and ideas and start to conceptualize them as just a single thing that doesn't eat as much cognitive load, you can start to piece all of those together in a way that makes it look like you're doing a lot, when actually it's just that you've got sort of the right framework in your mind such that with the same amount of cognitive effort, you're kind of operating on these more densely packed abstractions. So that's my suspicion for like why, the people who are into STEM so disproportionately also play some kind of musical instrument, is like that, that type of abstraction just is parallel between the two. To the last question, I'm not very good at guitar. I think it's like the thing that I'll noodle around on, and like it's the best instrument for noodling. But I'm definitely like I wouldn't consider myself good at it.
Yeah. Our last question is from a freshman. It's kind of a deep question. It was what was the hardest challenge you faced, and what would your advice be to someone going through a similar issue?
Okay, I'm going to give a very abstract answer, which is bad for a podcast, because podcasts are better when you have like an anecdote that you can really hang the whole argument on. But I think the hardest things are often those that have to do with people and interpersonal relationships, and if there's something that's going wrong that you want to fix there, that the thing that makes it hard is knowing how it intersects into someone else's life. So it's almost never going to be like, oh, here's this like technical challenge that like I need to solve. Like if you ask anyone who's old enough, like what's the hardest thing, it's always going to have to do with something interpersonal. And so I think then like the ways that it's like anything that helps to build strong empathy or like communicate really clearly, like those go so far. And so given that this is podcast loosely centered around education, I'll try to circle it back to where like one of the things that is very hard to put into a curriculum, but arguably would be very impactful to students' future lives if you could do it successfully, is ways to systematize like good empathy and like really understanding where someone else is coming from, being to articulate the fact that you do understand that, and you know what that implies about arguments you're making or choices that you're doing, and also having the humility to like change yourself when you need to, because the source of the conflict is you, it's not them, right? So I realize that's all very broad and abstract, but you know.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for answering all of our questions, both the good ones and then the weirder ones about pies and Cernos. But we appreciate your time, Grant. Thank you for watching the Concast, and we'll see you next time.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the thoughtful questions.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.